Picture a small town where life feels safe, predictable, and ordinary. A place where neighbors know each other by name, and tragedies seem like distant stories from the evening news. Never something that could creep into your own backyard. But sometimes, behind that illusion of safety, darkness grows quietly, waiting to strike. Today, we dive into one of the most shocking and heartbreaking true crime cases in America. A story of betrayal, cruelty, and the devastating murder of a girl who trusted the wrong people. This is the haunting case of Skylar Neese. Skylar was born on the 10th of February, 1996, the only child of Mary and Dave Neese. Mary worked as an administrative assistant in a cardiac lab, while Dave was a product assembler at Walmart. They lived a modest, simple life, but for them, Skylar was everything. She wasn't just their daughter, she was their light, their pride, their reason to smile each day. Dave once recalled the moment he first laid eyes on his little girl. The first time I saw her, that was the greatest moment of my life. It was instant love. From the very beginning, Skylar's presence filled their home with warmth. She was a sweet, thoughtful child, often described as having a heart bigger than her tiny frame. She loved animals, so much so that she constantly brought home strays, nursing them with the same care and devotion she gave to her friends and family. Her father would often laugh and say, she'd bring home every stray she could find. Our house looked more like a little zoo at times. Skylar grew up kind, intelligent, and well-loved. She was the type of child parents dream of: bright in school, responsible, and endlessly compassionate. It was in elementary school that Skylar first met Shelia Eddy, a girl her age with a completely different kind of energy. While Skylar was sweet and grounded, Shelia was bold, mischievous, even a little wild. Yet, the two bonded quickly. When Mary and Dave met Shelia, they felt sympathy for her. She had come from a troubled home. Her parents divorced when she was just 4, and her father was disabled and unable to work. Like Skylar, she was an only child. That shared loneliness formed the roots of a friendship that seemed inseparable. Shelia became a regular presence in the Neese household. She didn't knock anymore, she'd just walk right in, as if she were part of the family. Sleepovers, dinners, countless hours of laughter and teenage chatter. Mary and Dave welcomed her with open arms, relieved that Skylar had such a close companion. And when high school came, Skylar and Shelia grew even closer. It was the kind of friendship people admired. Two girls, different but complementary, almost like sisters. To Skylar's parents, it seemed like a blessing. But what no one could predict was how easily the boundaries between friendship and danger could blur. When high school began, life seemed exciting for Skylar. She was thriving, good grades, well-liked by her teachers, and admired by her peers. She dreamed of one day becoming a criminal lawyer, and her parents would often joke that with her sharp wit and strong will, she was already halfway there. Her bond with Shelia grew even stronger when Shelia transferred to University High School, the very same school Skylar attended. Now, the girls could see each other every day, share classes, and navigate the messy world of adolescence together. For Skylar, this felt like the perfect setup. Her best friend by her side, both of them facing high school as a team. But then came Rachel Schoaf. Rachel was different from the two. She came from a wealthy, religious family and had been raised in a private Catholic school before transferring to University High. Sheltered for much of her early life, Rachel was eager to step into a more social, rebellious world. She was talented, too, an actress in school plays, often landing the starring roles, soaking in the attention like a spotlight she couldn't resist. It didn't take long before Rachel became the third piece of Skylar and Shelia's puzzle. The three girls quickly became inseparable, always together in person, and when apart, constantly connected by texts, calls, and Twitter posts. Their bond seemed so strong that others often described them as sisters rather than friends. To everyone looking in from the outside, it seemed unbreakable. But if you've ever been part of a tight-knit group of 3, you know how fragile that balance can be. Alliances form, jealousy brews, and someone almost always ends up feeling left out. And in this trio, that someone was Skylar. At first, the tension was subtle, Rachel and Shelia sharing private jokes, planning outfits to match each other, and leaving Skylar on the sidelines. But by the summer of 2012, the cracks in their friendship were impossible to ignore. Rachel and Shelia seemed bound together by a new intensity, and Skylar, once the center of her own story, now felt like the third wheel. On the 4th of July, 2012, while Rachel and Shelia made plans together, Skylar sat home alone. Her mother remembers her pacing the house, restless and downcast. Skylar was an honors student who loved to read classics, but that night, not even her favorite books could distract her from the sting of being excluded. At some point, she turned to Twitter, her emotions spilling out into a single bitter post. Sick of being at effing home. Thanks, friends. Love to hang out with you all too. Asterisk. It was the raw cry of a teenager, desperate not just for attention, but for inclusion, for reassurance, that she wasn't being pushed aside by the very people she trusted most. But if the 4th of July was the night Skylar felt forgotten, the 5th of July would mark the beginning of a nightmare far darker than she or anyone could ever imagine. The evening of the 5th of July, 2012, seemed ordinary enough. Skylar had worked her usual shift at Wendy's, finishing around 10 p.m. She came home, greeted her parents who were relaxing in the living room, and after a short chat, kissed them both goodnight. Dave remembers it vividly. She put her arm around her mom, kissed her, and said, "I love you, Mom." Then she turned to me and said, "I love you, Dad." Those would be the last words he ever heard from his daughter, because Skylar had no intention of staying in her room that night. Around 12:30 a.m., she quietly slid open her bedroom window. A small bench had been placed beneath it to help her climb out. With her purse, wallet, and phone in hand, she stepped out into the night. Security cameras from the apartment complex captured her crossing the parking lot, heading toward a car waiting across the street. She climbed into the back seat, and the car drove away. Sneaking out wasn't entirely unusual for Skylar. Like many teenagers, she had recently started pushing against rules, smoking, drinking, staying out past curfew. Her closest friends, Shelia and Rachel, often joined her in these late-night adventures. To her parents, she was still a responsible, grounded girl, but behind the scenes, Skylar was exploring the edges of rebellion. And yet, nothing about this night would follow the usual pattern. The next morning, Dave returned from his shift at Walmart, expecting to hand Skylar his car so she could drive to work. He knocked on her bedroom door, but there was no answer. The door was locked, which was unusual for the middle of the day. A chill ran through him as silence pressed against the walls. Stepping outside, he looked toward her window. The bench was still there. The window was ajar. In that moment, he knew. Skylar had snuck out, and she hadn't come back. At first, her parents tried to stay calm. Maybe she was at a friend's house. Maybe she'd overslept. But when Wendy's called to report that Skylar hadn't shown up for her shift, a shift she never would have missed, their unease turned to terror. Mary and Dave phoned Shelia, hoping she might know something. She claimed she had spoken to Skylar around midnight, but hadn't seen her since. Hours later, Shelia changed her story, saying that she and Rachel had, in fact, picked Skylar up that night, but that Skylar insisted they drop her off at the end of the street to avoid waking her parents. It was a flimsy explanation. Soon after, Shelia and her mother arrived at the Neese home, offering to help search the neighborhood. Together with police, they went door to door, asking if anyone had seen Skylar. To Mary and Dave, it seemed like Shelia was devastated, desperate to help. She even cried in Skylar's bedroom, clutching her belongings as if mourning the loss of her closest friend. But surveillance footage would later reveal the truth. Skylar wasn't dropped off near her home. She was last seen getting into Shelia's car at 12:31 a.m., and she never returned. At that moment, no one could know just how dark and twisted this story was about to become. From the very beginning, Skylar's parents felt the urgency. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. But convincing the police was another matter. When authorities reviewed the grainy surveillance footage, they saw Skylar stepping into a vehicle just after midnight. Because it appeared that she left willingly, police suspected she might be a runaway. And since she was 16, her disappearance didn't meet the strict criteria for an Amber Alert. To the Neese family, it felt like a gut punch. Mary and Dave begged the officers to listen. She would never run away. She loved her life. She loved us. She wouldn't just leave. But their pleas were met with skepticism. As hours turned into days, they realized they couldn't wait for the system to catch up. They had to take matters into their own hands. They printed flyers with Skylar's photo, her description, what she was last seen wearing, and plastered them across town. Friends, neighbors, even strangers joined the effort, desperate for answers. and among the volunteers always at the front was Shelia Eddy. To anyone watching, Shelia seemed like the picture of a grieving best friend. She cried openly, offered to pass out flyers, and constantly called Mary and Dave for updates. She even posted on Facebook, "Skylar, come back. I can't do this without you. I miss you too much." It looked genuine. It looked real. But behind those tears was a performance so cold, so carefully constructed, that it would later shock the entire community. Meanwhile, Rachel appeared far more distant. On the very day Skylar vanished, she left for a church camp trip with her mother. Friends noticed a fresh cut on her ankle, but when asked about it, she brushed it off. When questioned by investigators over the phone, she was oddly calm, almost rehearsed. "I don't really know where Skylar Island. Shelia probably knows more than me." What investigators didn't realize at first was how perfectly their stories aligned too perfectly. Every detail matched, down to the smallest phrasing. It was as if they had rehearsed every word, and soon, whispers began to circulate. Rumors. Dark ones. At school, students gossiped that Rachel and Shelia might have had something to do with Skylar's disappearance. Online, strangers speculated about human trafficking, abduction, even murder. Mary and Dave, meanwhile, were caught in an agonizing limbo. They clung to hope, but deep down, Mary admitted she felt her daughter was gone. Dave tried to hold on longer, telling himself there had to be another explanation. Weeks turned into months, and pressure mounted. Finally, the West Virginia State Police and the FBI joined the case. Special Agent Morgan Spurlock and Officer Jessica Colbank began to dig deeper into the girls' accounts, and almost immediately, Jessica had a gut reaction to Shelia. She later described her as a narcissist, someone who smiled too easily, who seemed a little too eager to be part of the investigation. Something about her felt wrong. Rachel, on the other hand, looked fragile, nervous. She distanced herself from Mary and Dave, while Shelia leaned closer, embedding herself into the grieving family's trust. It was a perfect mask, and the cracks were just beginning to show. By the fall of 2012, the search for Skylar had consumed the small community of Star City. Everyone wanted answers, but none came. And yet, whispers of suspicion grew louder with each passing day. At school, classmates noticed that Shelia and Rachel were inseparable, laughing, whispering, sometimes even dressing alike, as if to flaunt their bond. Meanwhile, Skylar's absence hung heavy in the halls. Friends felt something wasn't right, and rumors swirled that the two girls knew more than they were admitting. Online, speculation spread like wildfire. People wondered if Skylar had run away, if she had been kidnapped, or even if her so-called best friends had harmed her. Shelia, ever active on Twitter, seemed to bask in the attention. She posted cryptic tweets, some lighthearted, some haunting. "Always keep your cool. We really did go on 3. It was as though she couldn't resist dropping breadcrumbs, taunting the world with hidden truths. Investigators kept a close eye. They combed through Skylar's journal, which revealed her growing frustrations with Shelia, how Shelia always sought attention, how her wild behavior was changing their friendship. In one chilling entry, Skylar even wrote about walking in on Shelia and Rachel during a drunken sleepover, discovering their romantic involvement. Though she supported the LGBTQ+ community, she admitted feeling deeply uncomfortable and pushed aside. Soon after, Skylar vented on Twitter, "I'd tell the whole school all the S, I know. Too bad my friends are having lives without me." Asterisk, it was raw, it was angry, and it suggested she knew secrets that might have made her a threat. Meanwhile, Mary and Dave struggled with the gnawing silence. They knew their daughter would never run away, and every day that passed only confirmed their worst fears. They leaned on each other, but the weight was crushing. In September 2012, investigators obtained warrants to seize the electronics of both Shelia and Rachel. Their text messages revealed nothing conclusive, but their synchronized stories and their rehearsed calm only deepened suspicions. Then came December, and with it, the breaking point. Rachel's life began to unravel. Her parents, increasingly worried about her mental state, noticed violent outbursts and severe anxiety. In a desperate move, they even moved back in together, despite being divorced, just to keep her away from Shelia's influence. But the pressure was too much. One evening, after discovering her father was living in the house again, Rachel snapped. She ran screaming through the neighborhood, sobbing uncontrollably. Her parents chased her down, eventually restraining her as she threatened to end her own life. The police were called. Rachel was admitted to Chestnut Ridge, a psychiatric facility in Morgantown. For 5 long days, she was cut off from Shelia, unable to seek comfort from the girl who had become both her anchor and her chain. And when Rachel finally emerged from that facility, she was no longer able to hold the lie together. At her lawyer's office, sitting across from investigators, she broke down, and with a trembling voice, she uttered the words that shattered the entire illusion. "We stabbed her." The room fell silent. The case, once shrouded in uncertainty, had just taken the darkest possible turn. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. "We stabbed her." Investigators who had braced themselves for an overdose cover-up or an accidental death were stunned. They had never imagined the truth could be this brutal. Rachel, her composure shattered, began to spill everything. She and Shelia had planned Skylar's murder for weeks, months even. They had talked about it openly, coldly, as if plotting the end of their best friend was just another teenage secret. The motive? Rachel admitted it with chilling simplicity. "We just didn't like her anymore. No rage-filled fight, no sudden explosion of anger. Just a calculated decision to erase someone they once called a sister. On the night of the 5th of July, 2012, the plan unfolded." Shelia drove her silver Toyota Camry, Rachel in the passenger seat. Skylar, unsuspecting, climbed into the back. They told her they were going to their usual spot near Blacksville, a quiet stretch along the Pennsylvania border where they often smoked weed. Skylar, trusting them despite the recent distance in their friendship, agreed. When they arrived at the secluded spot, the three got out of the car. After a few minutes, Skylar realized she had left a lighter inside. As she turned back toward the car to retrieve it, Rachel and Shelia looked at each other. 1, 2, 3. At the count of 3, both girls pulled kitchen knives from their hoodies and lunged. Skylar screamed, the betrayal sinking in as quickly as the blades. She tried to run, but after a stab wound to her knee, she collapsed. Still, she fought, kicking, clawing, crying out into the empty night. Rachel admitted she stopped after the first few strikes, but Shelia didn't. Blow after blow, she kept stabbing, her face cold and determined. Skylar's final word was a single, heart-wrenching plea. Why? But there was no answer, only silence as her life ebbed away. The two girls had brought everything they thought they needed: paper towels, bleach, a change of clothes, and even a shovel. But when they tried to dig a grave, the ground was too rocky. Instead, they dragged Skylar's body beneath a tree, covering her with branches and dirt before abandoning her in the darkness. In a detail that still chills investigators, they even left her phone by her side, switched off as if severing her final connection to the world. After washing up in a creek, Rachel and Shelia changed into clean clothes, dumped the bloody rags along the way, and drove home as if nothing had happened. By 6 a.m., Shelia was back on Twitter. Her message? Always keep your cool. It was a monstrous act, hidden behind a teenage smile. The police now had a confession, but they needed more evidence. A body. Something concrete to ensure justice for Skylar. Rachel agreed to lead them to the site where they had left her friend. But when they arrived, snow blanketed the woods, concealing everything. They would have to wait for spring before finding her. Still, the truth was out, and once it began to unravel, there would be no stopping it. Winter pressed on, and with it, the Neese family's agony deepened. Mary and Dave clung to hope, but after Rachel's confession, investigators knew the truth. Skylar was no longer alive. The problem was proving it. Snow covered the Pennsylvania woods where Rachel claimed Skylar's body had been left. The girls had hidden her beneath branches and debris, and until the thaw came, there was no way to recover her remains. For months, investigators had nothing but Rachel's word and the gnawing weight of suspicion. Meanwhile, Shelia Eddy carried on with a performance so convincing that, for some, it bordered on grotesque. She stayed close to Skylar's grieving parents, constantly calling them, sitting in Skylar's room, even crying with Mary on her bed. She flooded social media with messages that painted her as a heartbroken best friend. "Rest easy, Skylar. You'll always be my best friend. I miss you more than you could ever know." But investigators were watching her closely. When Shelia was called in for a polygraph, she failed spectacularly. Her calm, cheerful demeanor crumbled into evasions and inconsistencies. Rachel, on the other hand, was unraveling in a different way. Isolated from Shelia by her parents, burdened by guilt and fear, she began to show signs of mental collapse. After her dramatic breakdown and stay in the psychiatric facility, she was more fragile than ever. And investigators knew they had one girl ready to crack and another hiding behind arrogance. Then, as spring arrived in 2013, the snow melted. On a somber day in March, law enforcement returned to the woods near Blacksville. Guided by Rachel, they searched the area where she and Shelia had dragged Skylar's body. And there, under a blanket of branches and decay, they found her. DNA confirmed what everyone feared. The remains belonged to Skylar Neese. The discovery shattered any lingering illusions. Mary and Dave, who had fought tirelessly to bring their daughter home, now faced the cruel confirmation of her fate. Meanwhile, investigators moved swiftly. Blood evidence had already been found in Shelia's trunk, linking her directly to the crime. Combined with Rachel's confession and the recovery of Skylar's body, the case was airtight. On May 1, 2013, Rachel Schoaf turned herself in, pleading guilty to second-degree murder. Her cooperation with investigators earned her a reduced charge, but it also cemented her role in the betrayal of her friend. Shelia, however, was still pretending innocence. That ended on a warm day in May when police found her dining casually at a Cracker Barrel restaurant with her mother. As she left the restaurant, officers moved in and placed her under arrest for first-degree murder. Stunned, Shelia asked her mother, "Mom, is it going to be okay?" Her mother's reply was heavy with truth. "I don't know." The masks had finally come off. The grieving best friend was now revealed as a cold-blooded killer. The inseparable trio had become a twisted tale of betrayal, cruelty, and murder. And for Skylar's parents, the nightmare had only just begun. With the arrests of Rachel Schoaf and Shelia Eddy, the media frenzy exploded. What had begun as a missing persons case now stood revealed as a shocking betrayal. A murder carried out by two teenage girls against the very friend who trusted them most. The story was everywhere. HLN, CNN, even Anderson Cooper. The nation couldn't look away. For Mary and Dave Neese, the courtroom became both a battlefield and a prison. They had to sit only feet away from the girls who had destroyed their lives, forced to hear every detail of the night Skylar died. Rachel was the first to face judgment. On May 1, 2013, she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, admitting she had helped lure Skylar to her death and participated in the stabbing. In exchange for her cooperation, prosecutors recommended a sentence of 30 years in prison with eligibility for parole after 10. During sentencing, Rachel addressed the Neese family directly, her voice shaking as tears streamed down her face. "I am so sorry. I don't know if there's a proper way to make this apology, because there are no words to describe the guilt and remorse I feel each day for what I've done. The person who did this was not the real me. I pray every day for forgiveness, and I pray for eternal peace for Skylar." But for Mary and Dave, those words rang hollow. Dave responded bluntly, "She murdered my daughter in cold blood. She can take her apologies and set them where they belong because that's all they're worth." Then came Shelia. Unlike Rachel, she showed no remorse. In court, she appeared more concerned about her hair, her makeup, her appearance, than the brutal crime she had committed. Even as she faced the Neese family, she displayed no guilt, no sorrow, only self-preservation. Her defense attorney himself admitted, "I looked at everything, and I couldn't find a reasonable explanation for her actions. There is nothing to defend." On the 24th of January, 2014, Shelia finally pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison with mercy, meaning she would be eligible for parole after 15 years. Mary, holding back tears, later reflected, "You have to be mentally ill to do something like this. But even then, when people don't like someone, they stay away from them. They don't lure them out, stab them 50 times, and leave them in the woods." The contrast between the two girls could not have been sharper. Rachel appeared broken, guilt-ridden, crushed under the weight of her actions. Shelia, by contrast, remained chillingly cold, smiling at times in court, tweeting cryptic messages even after Skylar's death. and only ever showing emotion when her own future was at stake. For the Neese family, justice was served, but it was far from healing. Skylar had been their only child their entire world, and now, that world was gone. With the sentences handed down, the legal chapter of Skylar's case came to a close. But for Mary and Dave Neese, the pain was only beginning. How do you go on when your only child, your light, your future, has been stolen in such a brutal, senseless way? Every corner of their home was a reminder. Skylar's favorite books stacked neatly on a shelf, her clothes still hanging in the closet, the old nightgown she called her Goody, a childhood security blanket she had cherished. These were fragments of a life cut short, and they weighed on Mary and Dave every single day. Yet, even in their grief, the Neese family chose to fight for change. Out of their tragedy came Skylar's law. Before Skylar's death, West Virginia's criteria for issuing an Amber Alert were rigid alerts, were only issued if authorities believed a child had been abducted. Because Skylar was thought to be a runaway, no alert was triggered, wasting precious time. Mary and Dave knew this had to change. Their advocacy paid off. Skylar's law was passed, ensuring that when a child is reported missing in West Virginia, authorities will immediately issue an alert whether or not abduction is suspected. It was a hard-won victory, born of heartbreak, but it meant that other families might be spared the same nightmare. The place where Skylar's body was found was later transformed into a quiet memorial. Friends and family gathered to place flowers, set a bench, and create a space of reflection. Through holidays and seasons, they decorated it with love, turning a scene of horror into a sanctuary of remembrance. But grief is not so easily soothed. Mary and Dave remained shattered. As Mary once said, "How can our lives ever be happy again? We're missing a piece that can never be replaced." They hold on to each other, clinging to the love that still binds them, even as the shadow of loss looms over every day. Dave has vowed that when parole hearings come for Shelia and Rachel, he will fight to keep them behind bars. "They will never walk free if I can help it," he swore. And so, Skylar's story lives on not only as a chilling tale of betrayal and teenage cruelty, but also as a reminder of resilience. Her memory breathes through the law that bears her name, through the flowers that bloom at her memorial, and through the voices of those who still whisper her story, refusing to let her fade into silence. Skylar Neese was only 16. She had dreams of becoming a lawyer, of building a life beyond her small town. She never got the chance. But through her story, others may be saved. Even now, years after the courtroom doors closed and the headlines faded, the story of Skylar Neese lingers like a wound that never truly heals. For Mary and Dave, life has been permanently divided into before and after. Before July 2012, their days were filled with laughter, routines, and the joy of watching their daughter grow into a young woman. After, only grief, emptiness, and memories that ache like phantom pain. What makes this case so unbearable isn't just the violence, it's the betrayal. Skylar wasn't taken by a stranger lurking in the shadows. She wasn't the victim of chance. She was betrayed by the two people she trusted. Most girls she called her best friends. That truth gnaws at the heart. It forces us to ask, how could two teenage girls plot something so cruel, so calculated? How could they smile to her face, share secrets, eat dinners at her table, and then lead her into the woods to die? When asked why, Rachel's answer was chilling in its emptiness. We just didn't like her. No rage. No revenge. Just cold indifference. It's a reminder of how fragile trust can be, and how evil doesn't always wear a mask of menace. It can look like friendship, like laughter, like the girl who walks through your front door without knocking. For the community of Star City, Skylar's death left scars that will never fade. Students returned to classrooms haunted by the memory of an empty desk, once filled by a bright girl with big dreams. Teachers who had encouraged her to become a lawyer now carry the sorrow of what might have been. And for the rest of us, Skylar's story forces uncomfortable reflection. It asks us to consider the complexities of teenage friendships, the undercurrents of jealousy and exclusion, and the way social media can amplify both connection and cruelty. But beyond the questions, beyond the horror, there is Skylar's legacy. Through Skylar's law, her name now protects children across West Virginia. Through her parents' tireless advocacy, her memory has been transformed into action. And through every retelling of her story, Skylar is remembered not as a victim, but as a vibrant, intelligent, loving young woman who deserved so much more. When you walk past her memorial, you'll see flowers, a bench, tokens of love left by strangers and friends alike. It is a place of silence, of remembrance, and of resilience. And if you listen closely, you might hear her final question echoing through the trees. Why? A question without an answer. A question that will haunt forever.